So the first thing I'd like to do is ask if you have questions among yourselves, questions, comments about what's been said. I mean, one thing that I'd like to say right off is, well, two things, actually. First, how different it is to listen to painters talk than to listen to a scholar's talk. And so the whole vocabulary changes. And so as I'm sitting there listening to you, I'm beginning to think of things about Motherwell, whose work I know pretty well, that I never thought about before because of the way all three of you were talking about very specific physical things. So I thought, for me, that was in itself a really big revelation. You know, after all these years of looking at Motherwell, and I've also done things with my hands also, so I'm not coming to this strictly as somebody who only writes, but I was really fascinated to have three people who have thought so much about painting. Second thing is that I hadn't really thought of, that all three of your work has a strong graphic quality, which is not necessarily a characteristic of a lot of contemporary art. But a graphic quality, no, that's not exactly true. It's not true at all, in fact. But what, a graphic quality, but at the same time, an enormous amount of painterly variation, textual variation, visual variation. And I think that's something that among his colleagues was almost unique for Motherwell, which is to say that you've got geometric forms against splatter, against dotting, that vocabulary of varied surfaces, and all three of you in different ways have that in your work. So that's my reaction. Maybe that get the three of you talking a little. Yes.
But I think part of that is that where the work is in reaction to this idea of the integrated surface, right? So if you think of almost anybody from the 50s or 40s, it's like, you don't step out of this world that you've sort of created in the painting. And I'm just, in my own case, that's something that I want to say, that I'm showing, that it's not just one location. In painterly language, I guess that's what I'm using for the word location. That's what I mean. And even though I think as I've gotten older and painted more, it is just becoming one painterly language. It's just got many facets, so. I don't know if you want to respond to that.
Well, yeah, one thing we didn't really go into, but one thing that David and Carrie and I have all faced generationally is that the primary mark was so taboo as a painterly language for abstract painters in our generation. Part of it is that post-Warhol, seeing the power of the photomechanical language, the only way to re-enter abstract painting was through this objectification that oftentimes took part or employed quasi-mechanical characteristics. And I know that David and I have both wrestled with this, and Carrie, I don't know, but I see aspects of this in her work as well, where, you're trying to find a way back into pure painting through a highly objectified practice. I mean, if I'm looking at these Motherwell works, I just can't conceive of making a painting the same way. I can't, it just isn't part of my studio practice. So I guess that's all I want to say about that. It's a little bit more specific as far as sort of what happened in our generation. And I think if you look at work by people like Christopher Wohl, I mean, you see it very, very apparent. And there are both, positive and negative attributes to it. but it certainly was a major shift in terms of painting practice.
Let's see, John. I also loved the collage show at the Guggenheim, and it was up at the same moment as the Chris Wohl show. And I had thought at first, oh, what a terrible combination. Someone wasn't thinking. And then I walked in to look at the Motherwell, and I saw all the relationships. The use of words as kind of political slogans almost. That the posters that he was taking collage elements from were the current technology of reproduction. And Chris is now using computers and other ways as our current way. And there were these attempts at kind of political significance through formal means that are related. So I think maybe it's not as different.
Well, I hope not. I mean, it's sort of a self-critique that I hope I can get away from.
The other issue that I love to talk about is when I came to New York, there was a really strong bias against being an artist and an intellectual, even writing and an artist. I mean, my teachers distrusted Barnett Newman. He was a writer. He wasn't really a painter, a theorist, not a painter. And they, I think, distrusted Motherwell for similar reasons. And I think I gave in too much to that when I was young. I was afraid to write because of the repercussions. And it was a terrible thing. And I think it is shifting now, because both of you have written a lot. And I think it's a really healthy thing that artists can be intellectuals and be thoughtful enough to express themselves in several different ways. Do you feel it's getting any better, or is it bad still? I don't know.
I still think it's problematical. You know, I think it's a question's been raised again with the current Frank Stella retrospective at the Whitney. Looking at that historically and thinking about his friendships with Carl Andre and Hollis Frampton, and that they came out of this, you know, very privileged intellectual environment of Andover and then Princeton. You know, these are people who came out of a very specific time and place in terms of the intellectual, educational history of the U.S. And we have spent a lot of time presently in a critique of some of the facets of that time period. But for me, as somebody who comes out of a liberal arts as opposed to art school background, you know, I always very much felt a sympathetic affinity to Motherwell, Stella, and as I said, I was, you know, my primary studies were literature and art history, but I always knew I wanted to be a painter, you know. So I always felt like it was possible, and I think that one thing I encountered when I got to New York and met people like David Reed was, you know, these were dazzling intellectuals and very, very verbal people. It's funny, the abstract painting community in New York that I encountered, there was no bigger group of talkers and people who were widely knowledgeable about literature, film, self-taught autodidacts. Always interesting also this point we made about, you know, painters in terms of their relationship to art history versus art historians. You know, painters take these very idiosyncratic, self-created logics for everything. There's a reason for everything. And, you know, to be in these barroom discussions with this group of people, I had never met anybody you know, who were as verbal as these supposedly nonverbal practitioners.
I guess, I don't, oh, sorry. Okay, this is good. Okay, that's much better. Good idea. I mean, the thing about Barnett Newman and Motherwell, though, it's like night and day. I mean, you know, to me, this idea about how class works out through this lineage is just so interesting, and the fact, and you were talking about Milton Resnick, so there's something honorable about being like the working class guy who writes.
Notice the rhetoric, we've been talking about this a lot in my class this semester, the rhetoric that Stella chose to employ to explain himself. Here, this, you know, intellectual guy says, you know, I want to be related to the house painter, you know, and you're talking about pragmatism. Well, pragmatism, literalism, self-reliance, the ascendancy of the object as the object, all of these are essentially anti-intellectual notions that become heightened in their philosophical integrity by the type of rhetoric that these artists begin to associate themselves with in the 60s and the 70s. And even coming to New York in the 1980s, there were a strong set of taboos. So that the first lectures that I gave were completely formalist lectures, where it would be like reading a car manual. You know, this is 72 inches, it's cadmium medium, you know, and because that was the de rigueur style. And I accepted, you know, why that was important.
Yeah, I mean, I felt this was all very powerful too, and I fell for it. I was a middle-class kid, college educated from California, probably with a background more like Motherwell than like Milton Resnick, but I accepted all of Milton's prejudices and fell for it big time, and I'm a bit ashamed of myself. I mean, shall I tell my story? I think I've told Jack. At the studio school, which we saw up on the screen a few times, where Myra Shapiro was also a teacher when I was there, Mercedes Matter, who ran the school, to get things done, she would have famous artists sign petitions. So to buy the building at 8 West 8th Street, where they are, she had a bunch of artists sign, and I would always volunteer to go get the signature. So I went up to get the signature of Robert Motherwell. I knocked on the townhouse door uptown. I expect it was Frankenthaler who let me in and then disappeared, and I went in where they were having breakfast, and they had soft-boiled eggs on those cups. And I'd never seen that before in my life. I thought it was way too fancy, you know, for me. And then I think Motherwell came in and then had to go out for something, maybe to sign the petition. And I had noticed he had been reading a book, and I was just very curious to see what it was. And it was Plato. And I thought he must have put it out to impress me. But now, of course, after seeing his exchange with Arthur Danto, who is a friend of mine, and learning about his friendship with Shapiro and his background in philosophy, he was, I think, reading it. And I was so foolish to fall for this anti-intellectual rhetoric. Yeah, and being so arrested by the egg cup and not the Play-Doh. Yeah, that's right. Believing the egg cup and not believing the Play-Doh. That is not good.
audience question or comments? I'd just like to. I was interested to hear what David, when you were talking about the lead,
Yeah.
I studied film and culture. It's interesting, new American cinema at the time comes right out of this whole, school, and so much apropos. Like I'm thinking of Dog Star Man by Stan Brakhage, where you have the kind of layering and then specifically a film of Paul Schertz called Screen Center, where it was actually just an exploration of a Neville stylus digging into the emulsion. And that's so much, that happens so much when you're a filmmaker, you work frankly. But you love that. These kinds of amazing, things that come out of the spontaneous that is so, it's so elegant to be able to articulate. It's actually make a piece celebrate that decay. So I was just really struck by that.
Wow, that's a wonderful comment. I love those film works, especially Schertz. I've often thought if I ever was in a two-person show, the artist I'd most like to be with would be Paul Schertz. But I never quite saw the connection. I thought it more in terms of color and other things.
Very much comes right out of it.
Wow.
In a way, he never really wanted to leave. He was sort of, in a way, a kind of frustrated painter and saw this. A lot of times they see it in, economic terms.
Yeah.
Where follows money. What can I do that I can step out of this? Now do this film. And in fact,
Wow, yeah. That's a really great comment. And I'm going to look into this and think about it more. Yeah, that Hampton too. Well, and now we've talked about the bias against being an intellectual and a painter, but also even intellectual painting. There's bias against that in the 70s. I mean, my favorite artists are people like Lozano and Joe Baer, and say Bridget Riley, who are intellectual painters, and their work was not accepted at all in the 70s for all the wrong reasons.
I want to go back to the thing that I want to go back to the thing that he brought up about the faking of the oil blot. I mean, I think it's such an interesting gesture because it's so automatic, whatever. It's like, is this the kind of sign for this kind of painting? Like that it has to have that. So that feels like this whole new little pocket of interesting thoughts.
Why it offended me so much.
John, you said a lot about feeling like you have this mental Rolodex and you have, it's all about reproduction or seeing these works in reproduction, and that kind of shaped you as an artist. But just what we've been talking about, this idea of reproduction is coming up again and again, and I'm wondering if it's already part of abstract expressionism, because we have, we talked about the Clifford Still replica paintings. We have a group of artists who were probably the first generation, at least in America, that were photographed all the time, that showed up in popular magazines and so forth. Franz Klein, it's the big secret that he made smaller sketches and then used the opaque projector to project them on the wall and kind of trace himself. So I think some of that reproduction we're saying is that still exists today and shapes the way we think about abstract expressionism was always already there from the beginning. But that's just, something I wanted to throw out there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the whole subject matter of how painters have used photography, going back to 19th century painting is yet to be really researched and explored fully. But I also, you know, you have the kind of dual quality. You're talking about Pollock and Motherwell and the photographs of Hans and Namuth, you know. It's the documenting of them as these heroic figures in these particular environments. I mean, look how powerful that photograph that you showed at the outset was, Carrie. I mean, for me, that kind of documentation is so narrative heavy in terms of mythologies. And, you know, the painting in that case becomes, and this plays into David's practice somewhat, you know, a prop in a stage set, you know, it's a theatrical interjection of the object back into the recorded presentation of it.
I just want to follow up on that. And Katie Siegel just curated the show called Around and After Frankenthaler, is that what it's called? Anyway, it was at the Rose Museum, and in the catalog there are a couple of essays in which David Belasco talks about how the media worked in relation to what people were actually doing in their studios. So this knowledge that this is what, you know, is required to sort of keep this myth intact versus, I mean, in the case of the women painters who were working at that time, they were presented as these kind of, you know, beautifully coiffed people in front of these fierce paintings. So there were never these sort of studio shots. So it's very interesting, like the construction of all these things. And I somehow think of that gesture as being part of that. Because like, what would it look like in black and white? It would be even more, you know, strange.
Yeah, certainly the photograph of Motherwell in the studio with the painting on the easel and the Edgar Allan Poe photograph is something I encountered at about age 19 and was just a mind blower as far as trying to, you know, put that together. So yeah, I think that, but that's a different aspect. That's how these artists were presented to the world as opposed to how they used or employed photography and or how much they were already beginning to do what is contemporary practice, which is be in the receivership of image, as I call it, you know, indexing or pre-associative methodologies. But I think that these things are accelerating because of the image proliferation. So for example, that photograph that I talked about where Motherwell is in the studio with the Edgar Allan Poe, that's one image. But now I've seen, you know, every image possible, you know, and it's changed the kind of meta consciousness and the construct surrounding these artists.
Isn't there a different motivation, perhaps now? Yeah, this is a different motivation, not necessarily by the artists, but by the various media that are presenting the artists, because a lot of this proliferation, I think, has to do with the market. So, you know, Motherwell in his studio in 1945 or so with Edgar Allan Poe on the wall, that is in a different world from photographs of people in their studio as heroic people creating very high-value objects. You know, the whole press, I mean, the idea of press coverage for an artist in the 1940s, and you know, anywhere in the world, but especially in the United States.
But one great thing now is thanks to social media, people can construct their own images to some extent. So the mythologizing is self-mythologizing as opposed to somebody else's version of it. And you can still construct something that is as, I mean, for me, that's a constructed image, the one of Motherwell in the studio. But I don't think it need be completely now mediated by the powers that be. And I think that is a democratizing, positive impact of social media image proliferation, particularly the way artists have seized control of how their own practice is put out into the world.
guess so. This is a tiny bit off topic, but I just wrote an essay on Louise Fishman for her, she's having a retrospective. And basically at the Neuberger Museum in the spring. And basically the essay is about her coming up as a painter and knowing that she was a lesbian and identifying with all the art news images of Klein. You know, it's like it was so gendered that there's like no place for her to go. So it's this really interesting idea about how that also affects us, what we make, how we make it, how we think of ourselves. Anyway, that's my sidebar.
Okay, I think I'm supposed to say thank you all for coming. This is like on NPR when they say to somebody in the middle of an interview and you have 7 seconds. So I have 7 seconds, and I want to thank you all for coming on behalf of the archives, if I may speak for the archives in this case, the Dedalus Foundation, and everybody who participated. Thanks.